Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Week I Review. You can call me a guy who has some practice writing corporate process documentation. Today, I am talking about how an episode of the Week I Review comes to be. For those who missed yesterday's festivity kickoff, this week, actually today, marks the 1-year anniversary of this channel, which seemed like an appropriate time for some reflection. So I'm doing 5 separate videos about it, the most I have ever done or will ever do in 1 week. It is going to be well over an hour of Week I Review goodness, so if that is the thing you want, get hype, I guess. This video is sort of a behind-the-scenes part 1, while I will talk a little bit today about my setup. If you're more interested in what I use than how it's used, come back tomorrow for an exhaustingly in-depth gear breakdown. And if you only care about one specific aspect of my video making process, which has remained largely the same for all 52 weeks, I've put the approximate time codes for pre, mid, and post-production on screen. So, feel free to skip around, I guess. And now, without further ado, I've been reviewing things semi-professionally on the internet for more than 8 years at this point, so I've got a system pretty well in place, both in terms of how I think about subjects and actually write reviews. I spend a lot of time writing. Indeed, more hours are spent in Word than anywhere else. But where I'm working in Word is all over the place. I write in the park during a beautiful sunset, when I'm riding a bike down the street, during my lunch break at work, wherever. Most of these reviews are written primarily on my phone during commutes and other out and about downtime. If I can avoid writing at home, I do. Obviously, this is dependent on how far in advance I know what I'm going to be writing about, and also how quickly and definitively I figure out what to say on the subject. Though I'm not always sure, I usually have a pretty good idea of what at least the next week's video will be, and sometimes I will have a set calendar. Take the particular 3-week run. I had tickets to see Danielle Sloss do Now all the way back in February. Then the Kung Fu musical Dragon Spring Phoenix Rise that I reviewed the following week, I got tickets for in May. And then Midsummer's I got in early June, but was already planning on long before booking was available. I was quite sure that I would be talking about each of those, even at those early stages. That level of pre-planning is rare, and even when there is a schedule of sorts, I've often gone off to do something else. As I mentioned in yesterday's video, I was going to review Falling in Reverse the week I ended up seeing Blackpink, but I decided not to review Falling in Reverse that Monday, the day before I knew Blackpink was even playing. So for a day, I had planned to review Season 4 of the comedy Superstore, which had just wrapped. I started writing that review, actually, but as much as I enjoyed it and had things to say about it, Blackpink was number 1 that week, and I didn't have time to do both. When I know what's coming up, I will try to jot down a few initial thoughts before I even see a thing. When I saw Hannah Gadsby do Douglas, it was obvious that I would be talking about Nanette, meaning I could write a couple hundred words about that without even seeing the new show. I didn't commit to seeing Salo or the 120 Days of Sodom at the Metrograph until the day before I actually did it, but that review was half written before I got to the theater. Whether I use what I pre-wrote or throw it all away, it is a valuable grounding point if I have trouble collecting my thoughts, which sometimes I do. I write in a pretty stream of consciousness way, and I will move between ideas mid-sentence and end up completely rewriting entire sections without even realizing it until I hit the end and have to figure out some sense of order, at which point I tend to pretty mercilessly hack down the word count. That's right, you're getting the short version here, folks. One major change I have made was a painfully obvious thing I should have done from the outset: read it out loud. At the start, I would just assume it was fine because in my head it was, but then have to make changes mid-shoot, which was a total nightmare. Now I read aloud and rewrite every single sentence until it feels natural when spoken. And Only at that point do I load it up to my teleprompter app. And then there are still times where I will change the wording slightly, saying things that are similar but don't quite match what scrolls past for whatever reason. But the foundation is far more solid as a result of the change. Most scripts take at least 3 hours, though this step can easily be much longer. Often, the more time spent on one aspect of production results in more time spent everywhere else. But the Burn This review was actually pretty interesting because it was so lopsided in terms of time spent. It took more than 6 hours to come up with a script that I was okay with, while the actual video was shot and edited in just under 3. I got home from work that day at 2:45, and the video was live at exactly 5:45, having just finished processing the literal minute before. And that's about right for production and post. I almost always shoot on the weekends, usually on Sunday, but occasionally Saturday or even Friday if I'm ahead of schedule on the writing. Assuming it is written on time, I try to shoot mid-morning because that's when the window light is at its most even, but I can't always pull that off. The set is my living room, and I am sitting on the edge of my coffee table. It is rather uncomfortable, but it gets me to the right height, so I deal with it. Our plants are not like this the rest of the time. Mostly they sit along the windowsill, but in order to sort of match the palm, I build them up on my left, your right. I have basically 3 possible lighting setups, though I really just use 2 now, either color on my face or color on the back walls. I know which one I'll be using ahead of time, but which actual colors I'll use, I figure out as I go, trying different shades or changing the light's angle or brightness until I find something that I think looks nice and ideally is appropriate to the content. To make my face a little more camera presentable, I typically use a matte powder to cut down on the natural shine that was problematically present during the first few videos. I don't use any other makeup, but of course I brush my teeth, floss, and try to make my hair generally all right, but I don't go too far with that last one, and I have been allowing it to be messier and messier recently. I actually did once completely redo a shoot because of my hair, but that was a weird exception and will probably never happen again. The little bit that serves as both intro and thumbnail is typically done first. I try to do something interesting as often as I can, but there's only so many ways to introduce a comedy special, and I can't afford to buy props for every intro, even if I could figure out a way to use them. The main shoot time is obviously dependent on both the length of the script and the number of takes I have to do, but I would say 45 minutes is about average. I usually do 2 takes unless I make some particularly glaring mistake or a technical problem occurs. After 3, my energy drops precipitously to the point where I have actually just packed it in for the day and reset the next. Once I've got the main angle, of course, I have to do my asides. I do not have 2 cameras set up, obviously, so this takes place after the main angle. It involves some reconfiguration of equipment to be a little more visually pleasing, as well as turning on this random lamp and changing which way the colored lights are facing when I point them at the back wall. All asides are done together, one after the other, and I repeat each 3 to 7 times, sometimes using a teleprompter, sometimes not. Typically that's the end of shooting, but before I take everything down, I will make sure to do what we will inaccurately call the DIT process. I take the SD cards from my camera and recorder, pull them onto the computer, I rename the files, then bring them into Premiere. Although I shoot in 4K and edit that 4K footage directly, I always do so on a 1080p timeline. First, I sync the audio and then make sure that the asides line up well enough. I always know where they are because there will be a drop in the audio levels since I am not talking for a brief, blissful period. If there is some slight continuity issue, it doesn't matter because no one will notice. But if it's really egregious, or if the focus is totally off, or like I completely forget one of them, as happened with Detective Pikachu, it's nice to not have to redo the setup. The last bit of recording is this pull-out thing that I have been doing increasingly often lately. It is never planned, but sometimes it's necessary. I do it either when I forgot critical information, like in the vegan burger comparison, or when I use bad information, like in the Danielle Lego Now video. And in the latter case, I actually use it to mask a jump cut. You see, when I pull the camera out, I switch to the next shot in the timeline, so I can seamlessly move from one part of the video to the next without you even noticing. Speaking of Pikachu, that video also involved me doing something I basically never do. Switch between takes. Although I usually run through this multiple times, I only ever use the final one. It was final for a reason. I often follow this rule while editing my short films as well, which is not necessarily advisable, but definitely makes that process go a whole lot faster. Pokemon Detective Pikachu was an exception in that I started with take one to get the genuine joy at seeing that Psyduck in the promotional card pack before going to take two after the first aside and then committing to that for the remainder. What I do more commonly hide in the cuts are restarts of a given post-aside section if I make a huge mistake or something otherwise feels off. It is definitely less frustrating to redo a few minutes if I make a catastrophic mistake than like 10. I don't intentionally throw asides in as a precaution, but when I feel they're appropriate, it is a nice extra benefit. Editing typically takes between 90 minutes and 2.5 hours. The Black Mirror episode actually took an hour 40, which I know because it was exactly 4 minutes longer than Fire Fraud, which Danielle had decided to rewatch while I was standing at my computer. On the rare occasions where I do things vlog style and need music, I grab the music first. I go to my subscription library of choice, which I did an entire video about if you're curious how I ultimately came to a decision on that, with a vibe in mind, and then listen to snippets until I've got one I like. I then throw it onto the timeline and edit to it, adding each new clip only when I've figured out what to do with the one before. Despite the fact that I have two monitors, I don't use the second screen to expand my editing workspace. Instead, I keep open at least one browser window with Google Images queued up. To be honest, I rarely think about what is going to be next to my head until I'm literally at the point in the timeline where a visual aid feels necessary, which I determine by just watching it. When I'm reviewing some kind of audiovisual media, I often feel compelled to show some kind of moving image, whether it's from a trailer or another clip. When it's a movie show that is available online, I try to acquire a copy for sparing use when I feel that it would be particularly beneficial or genuinely necessary, as in the case of discussing fight choreography in the review of The Night Comes For Us. When it comes to pictures, I usually listen until a proper noun is said, whether person, place, or thing, and then decide if a picture should accompany it. More often than not at this point, it should. So I go find one. This is actually why I don't work in 4K. Finding assets to work on a 1080p timeline can be hard enough when I'm looking for more obscure images. I would be basically unable to have visual aids at 4 times that. A concern that I have, though, is about properly using photos. Ever since MatPat posted his big thing about how image rights work, I've been a lot more careful with what I use, always making sure that my first search is filtered by images labeled for reuse, which is why the shots I use are rarely the most flattering. But when literally no such thing exists, I will either just let it be nothing, or in certain cases use a picture that isn't labeled as such while attempting to credit the photographer, because I don't know, it seems better than not having one at all. I'm still trying to figure that out, to be honest. Maybe one day I'll be able to afford a Getty license or something. That would be swell. To make those images look oh so profesh when they motion blur on and off screen, I just use a Premiere preset that I made based on a tutorial I found online that I call Transform plus Blur, that, well, blurs a thing during movement. The motion happens over 3 frames, and I manually set that up each time. It is a fairly tedious process, but it looks good. I don't do any color grading, so there aren't many visual effects I need to do. In fact, other than the sped up intro, there's just one: the outline on the score over the blown out window. It's probably not something anyone has ever really noticed, but where the image isn't overexposed, there's no stroke, because I prefer the white numbers without the outline, but it becomes unreadable over the window. So to address this, I duplicate the text, giving just one black outline, and then duplicate the image itself. I pull that copy into After Effects and use an obsolete function called Luma key to just disappear the overexposure. Then I clean up the edge a little bit and voila, the video is done. I don't rewatch it, not in its entirety. I'm so sick of watching and listening to myself at that point that I couldn't bear another 10 plus minutes of it. If I can get Danielle to do so and point out any mistakes, that is definitely my ideal. Otherwise, I just go to the start and end of each added image or effect or what have you and make sure that they're all set. Since I'm not editing this monologue, there's really nothing else to concern myself with. From there, it's a simple matter of exporting via Adobe Media Encoder with my YouTube preset. And while the file is exporting, I go to Photoshop and I do my thumbnail. I take a screenshot from the opening 3-second bit, and then I remove the background, add a white outline, and then put relevant images behind it to make it look like, a YouTube thumbnail that you might see on Insert Channel here. Once it's exported, I open the file, skip around it a few times to make sure that there are no obvious issues like missing audio. If it's bad, I go again. Otherwise, I upload it to YouTube and add all the necessary copy and keywords and then schedule it for the next Monday at 8:15 a.m. EST, which more often than not is between 10 and 12 hours in the future. There are some inefficiencies in my system, and it would be nice if I didn't have to set up from scratch every single time. But I think my process is a fundamentally solid one. It isn't too time-consuming, but it looks good. So it makes me look good. 7.7 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching. I forgot to shoot an outro to this video because it came at the end of a long day of shooting, and I honestly just wanted it to be over with. But I hope you liked the video. If you did, that's awesome. If not, I'm sorry. If you want to see more like tomorrow's epic gear breakdown, please subscribe. I hope to see you then.